Welcome and thanks everybody for coming. My name is Mark Bailey. I'm a DEQ Air Quality Manager here for the Eastern Region. And I first want to make sure everybody knows about the emergency exits. We have one in the back of the room, and one at the entrance here. The bathrooms up through the glass doors back there in the back of the room. Tonight's meeting is about the air quality application and the permitting process for the Red Rock Biofuels facility proposed for here in Lake County. DEQ wanted to have this meeting because we knew there was a lot of interest in this project. We also know there are existing concerns about air quality as well. We want to give people the opportunity to ask questions and discuss that as well. A few minutes, Walt will give a presentation. It's about 30 minutes long. And if you have questions during the presentation, go ahead and raise your hand and Walt will call on you. You can go ahead and answer those and just kind of have back and forth through the presentation. Many of you have questions that aren't directly related to the presentation. So we understand that too. And so after the meeting, we're going to hang out in the back of the room. I think Grayson is going to be here too. I forgot to sit kind of Lakeview. To answer questions you might have about these kind of issues as well. So it's really going on about 8:30 tonight. That's about it.
Yes.
Yeah. And Walt, here's Walt West. He's the senior environmental engineer for DEQ. He's out of the Bend office. And he'll be writing the permit for the Red Rock facility. So yours, Walt.
Again, my name is Walt West. I'm the engineer that will be writing the permit for this facility. And before I start with my presentation, I just had I want to get an idea of how many people that are here tonight were at the Red Rock meeting last week. So it looks like quite a few. It was a very good meeting. I think I did not attend, but I did see it online, and you can as well if you're interested. I did bring my business cards. That's one way to get a hold of me. If you send me an email, I can send you the link to see what they have to say about their process. And it could be helpful to give you some contrast between Red Rock Biofuels and the DEQ and how we handle things. I'm strictly a permit writer. So what I do is I look at their application and talk with them about completing certain aspects of that application and then move forward with drafting that permit. So as I start to get talking about the plant, I wanted to make sure that everyone understood what Red Rock Biofuels actually is proposing to do. Because there's this public opinion that biomass is a facility that brings in woody material, they put it into a boiler and they start it on fire and they create steam. And that's typically how we all think of biomass facilities. And I just want everyone to understand that is not what Red Rock Biofuels is proposing to do. They have a completely different type of process. They are going to bring biomass into the facility. They're going to prepare it, then they're going to gasify it. And that gasification of the woody biomass is referred to as pyrolysis. It's a pyrolysis process where they bring that wood into an environment where there's very little or no oxygen, and they heat it up very high temperatures. And what that does is it pretty much physically decomposes that wood into two products. They have ash that's left over, and then they have this gas material. And this gas material retains its flammability and BTU value to create a fuel that they then further process into one of the fuels that this facility is going to produce. And the fuels that this facility wants to produce is, as we know, is jet fuel, diesel, and naphtha. We all know what jet fuel and diesel is. Naphtha is a different type of fuel. It's a lighter type of fuel. It's very light. It has a lot of vapors associated with it. It's often used in, or considered like a white fuel, like a camp stove, used in camp stoves and that type of equipment. So it is commonly used, and they intend on producing up to around 15 million gallons a year, every 12 months, of these different types of fuel combined. So I wanted to make sure everybody understood that they're not going to actually be combusting biomass. They're not going to set a flame to it and have smokestack with this material. They're actually going to convert it. And as I go into my presentation, another thing I was really made aware of is that I'm a permit writer, and I talk a lot in permit writers' language. And I realize that when I talk like that, that I may say some terms or use some terminology that I think I treat it differently than maybe you do as people from the public that aren't really familiar with that terminology I use. So if I ever say anything that sounds different or weird, or doesn't make sense to you, please feel free to just ask me. You can raise your hand, and if I don't see you, just shout, and I will spend a little time to try to explain what I'm talking about, because I know that can be kind of confusing in itself. Just the other day, someone asked, I was talking about fugitive emissions, and someone's like, well, you know, what is a fugitive emission, you know? And it made me think, because I'll be using that term here tonight. And so what a fugitive emission is a point of emissions that is released into the atmosphere, but it's not conveyed through a stack or vent or some type of pipe. Once it's created at that point, it's released to the atmosphere, and that's what we consider a fugitive emission. Sort of different is a stack emission. And I will talk about those as well. But I just wanted to make sure that if I say something that you don't understand, you stop me, and I'll try to explain the best I can. Because it won't help either one of us if I'm up here talking a different language. So tonight, I'll describe the source, and what I'll do is I'll use that flow chart that I put on some of the tables as a process. It's a really good method for me to walk through what they're proposing to do. And in that, I'll talk about the points of emission, whether it be fugitive or through a stack. I'll go over their application and what was submitted and how I, as a permit writer, review that and talk to the source and draft the permit. And then I'll talk about my permitting process, how I actually get that permit drafted, and the rules and regulations that are applied when I do draft that permit. And then I'll talk about what happens after I draft the permit. And that's basically, I put it on public notice, and I'm going to come back to Ben, and I will conduct a hearing where we'll take formal testimony, whether it be verbal or written at that time. And I'll talk about that. And then, of course, you can always ask questions. Okay, I'll go ahead and move forward here. Now, this is the process flow diagram that Red Rock Biofuels provided in their application. I do have a few extra copies if anyone wants to take a look at them. I'm going to just use this as my path to explain what they do. I'm going to break this down so that you can understand what I'm talking about. As I go through this, I'm going to break it down into three basic sections. I'm going to talk about that area where they actually receive the biomass and prepare it for gasification. And then I'm going to go into how they gasify it and that process using the Fischer-Tropsch process and distillation to create the fuels that they're going to produce. And then I'll get into the tank farm. And as I go through each one of those, I will talk about those emission sources. So first, this is the beginning of their process. They have, this is where they receive and prepare the biomass for gasification. They have 2 trucks, dump stations that they are proposing. They're going to be partially enclosed. The trucks will come in, they'll be dumped, and they will be dumped into a hopper. That hopper will convey the biomass material through a series of magnets and sifters to take out any metal and other debris that they do not want in their biomass. Once they've done that, they convey that material into an enclosed chipper. Now this chipper is enclosed, and it will chip the biomass material to a nominal ½ inch or less. And that's what they want to send to the gasifier. So once it gets chipped, it goes through a series of conveyors and conveyor drops, and then eventually gets into a biomass building. And this dotted line here represents the biomass building. Once it's inside there, it's inside the building. And that's where they screen this material to separate out all the wood chips that met the specifications of a ½ inch or less. The stuff that doesn't make it through the screen goes to an overage pile which gets sent back to the chipper for further chipping. The stuff that, the biomass that makes the standard half inch or less gets moved on and stored in this facility. Now there's a number of points for fugitive emissions to occur along this path. And what fugitive emissions here are mostly when they dump biomass, they can create dust, dirt, or small particles to go up into the air. That's what I'm referring to when I say they have the capability of creating fugitive emissions here. They have that capability at the truck dump. As they take the biomass into the chipper, and as it's taken out of the chipper, as soon as it's out of the chipper, it's conveyed through a couple of conveyor systems where their biomass is dropped from one conveyor belt to another. And at that drop point, that's a potential for fugitive emissions. Once it gets in the building, that pretty much removes the chance for fugitive emissions, except for the overage pile that needs to be sent back to the chipper. So what they did in their application is they proposed putting water sprays anywhere where there's a potential for fugitive emissions. And that's how they plan on controlling those dust and any other emissions that are generated during those drops. And I have that listed as a control C01 up there. And it's not, they don't show, there are many of them, it's just not one, but they're saying that they are going to have those types of controls to minimize those emissions and control them. Once the biomass is in the building is vented on the ceiling or on the roof line to allow fresh air to move through. There's no controls on that ceiling vent, but they don't anticipate any fugitive emissions there either. So that is how they handle the biomass and how they're going to prepare it for gasification. So the next process is they take that chipped biomass and put it into an enclosed conveyor, and they send it to the gasifier heater. And that, on this diagram, is up here, and here's the gasifier heater. So it's coming in from this conveyor into this gasifier heater. This gasifier heater is basically a very large boiler, rated at 340 million BTUs per hour, so it's very big. And what that boiler does is it combusts natural gas, creates the steam, that is then used to heat that biomass in that oxygen-free environment, generating that synthetic gas that is used to produce their fuels. They also have an auxiliary boiler up here, and that boiler also combusts natural gas, and it's rated at 75 million BTUs. And it generates steam that supports that main gasifier heater in the event that it needs that extra boost of steam. So from there, the exhaust from both boilers is collected in one line and it is sent to a control system referred to as a selective catalytic reduction unit. And that selective catalytic reduction unit, the purpose of it is to control and reduce the amount of nitrogen oxides that are released as part of the combustion of natural gases. It will control the nitrogen oxide, and then after that, it is released to the atmosphere through a stack. Any steam that's left over after the gasification of the biomass can be sent to a steam turbine generator. And that's what this little line here is. It's a fully enclosed system, there's no combustion there. And what that steam turbine does is it allows the steam to hit the turbine blades, turn it, create electricity, which is used on site. And it also condenses the steam back to water to be returned to one of the heaters for re-steaming. So, going back to the gasifier heater, once that gasifier heater has synthesized synthetic gas and created the ash is pulled off as a waste product. And what this company, Red Rock Biofuels, will do is they'll pull that ash off, they'll separate it, and they're going to separate it through a series of conveyance systems to a ash loadout to a truck. Now this system, they told me that it'll either go to refuge or it'll be reused in some other industrial process. Yes?
What is the bottom ash? And is that charged different than this one?
Yes, the bottom ash, what I've been told, is it's a very hot ash, and so it needs to be wetted. It cannot be routed to a truck, it's too hot, so they wet it, and they have to find another way to remove that. But from what I understand, it's so hot that it has its own place where it needs to be cooled. And then it will be treated as the other ash once it's cooled and dried out.
What is a refuge?
Refuge is garbage. I'm sorry, who asked that? Oh yeah, refuge, what I mean is basically anything that's garbage or debris.
So where will the garbage be?
Oh, well, the garbage would be taken out early on in the receiving of the biomass. I could go back.
Some of the ash could go to.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you. I apologize. Some of the ash may not be reusable in as a beneficial use because it's kind of clunky or it has it's solid material. And for example, a cement plant might not want that. So they automatically separate it out and take it to a landfill. And it's not very much, it's very minimal, but there is the possibility of that stuff being generated.
So they're taking it to our landfill?
I'm not sure which landfill they're taking it to, they haven't told me. But it's not very much from what I understand. The majority of it will be.
If I could answer that.
Yeah, sure.
They have already said they're only going to take their typical office waste, or what any of us would have to the landfill here, they'll take the other to some of the locations.
Yeah, and they haven't shared that with me, but that's a good question.
They have.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, appreciate it. So that will be taken to some type of disposal, proper disposal place, wherever that may be. The ash that's taken to the loadout truck will be either, I think they're hoping to find someone to reuse that in like a cement type process. All these conveyors and processes they use to move that ash out of the gasifier, they're all enclosed. And there's a control on them called a bag house. And I don't know if a lot of people know what a bag house is, but either air from that enclosure is either pushed or pulled through that bag house. And that bag house has fabric in it. And when that material goes through, the particles in that air get stuck at the bag and the air passes through. And that's what a bag house does. It's sort of like a vacuum cleaner. It allows air to move through and it holds all the fine particulate matter. So this entire process for handling the ash is going to be controlled with the bag house. There are some potential for keeping of emissions at the loadout. That's when they actually put the ash in the truck. And that will be minimized using work practices and how they load that truck. Okay, so, yes.
So a bag house, is that a standard procedure in an operation like this?
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
It is. It's very good. It's a high quality control to control, for any type of fine material. You'll see them quite often, just for that process.
How long does that last?
The bag house, it requires routine maintenance because those bags are usually typically, they fill up and they get banged, and then that material that's in the bag falls out and then it gets sent to the truck loadout. So the bags themselves can last a very long time, but they have to do a lot of maintenance on that to make sure that it's properly operating. They have a magnet helix gauge often on that to just measure like the resistance in those bags so they can tell if they're getting kind of tight or if they have one that may have broken, the gauge is just dead. I mean, air is just moving through. They have those type of controls and then they can visually inspect them as well. Yeah.
Once a bag quantity fills, they have to empty it out. Where does it go then?
It will go back into the system. It typically gets back into the system to the loadout. That material is collected and taken where all the other ash is taken. It's basically there to prevent it from going into the atmosphere. And that's the main purpose there. And anything that's collected goes to the truck. Yes?
Now, will these bag systems work? Because they, at the last meeting, they talked about if they didn't have the wood products, that they would use the gas coming out of the pipe to do this system to make their diesel. They wouldn't have the forest products. Would this whole system be different? Is that part of their permit, that they would give you one for a wood system or using the gas coming out of the pipe? Because that's what they discussed at the meeting.
I'm not sure that I understand.
Because of the tree quantity and the fuel quantity of here, the upsets, they were going to use the gas to produce the diesel. So would this system be the same, or is there another system for another permit that they would have to do? Because they talk about, oh, we might get snow in July. Well, the way the climate change is going, it's going to be very hard to get out of the woods probably past April this year, you know? And so where does that fall in on this permit, or is it a different permit?
It would be a permit modification, and actually...
Because they did talk about it, so that's where would you be on that?
I think for them to do that, they would need to make some changes in their process.
Because they said they were going to do it.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be significant changes, but they would need to make some changes.
Right.
Because once this gas that they want to use is generated, they have to clean and remove the impurities. Now, if they use natural gas, there's no impurities to remove, so that kind of helps them. I mean, but the downside is, if they use natural gas, that's going to be much more expensive to process.
And that's what they said they were going to do, so that's what
it's going to be much more to cost to process. So I'm not sure. They haven't approached me on that at all.
And the emission offsets that have
emission
been talked
offsets?
about, yeah. What's
sure.
going on with that?
Well, let me talk about one thing, and then maybe I can touch on that.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
So, just so I understand, and to Sarah's point, Red Rock said that they could use natural gas as a fuel type to produce the product they want to produce.
Right.
And they haven't included anything in their permit application materials to you for that scenario.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. I have not seen anything in the
Would that be required if that's something that they intend on doing?
Right, because they've said it publicly.
It would be.
Yes, they've said it
It
publicly.
would be.
Yes.
It would change things. I don't know.
No, what I'm saying is that if they want to use it as a backup,
Yes, they need to tell me.
Okay.
they need to
And
tell
that
Okay.
needs to be included in the
All right.
application, and they have not.
all right,
Yeah.
thank you.
But if they use natural gas, it's better for us, really.
It's
Well, it
better-
becomes
it
a different
could be-
facility. Part of the concern that I have for this project is that it will turn into a natural gas fed project
Yes.
rather than a biomass fed project. And so the intention of the project may be misleading. And
Yes,
so that's what I'm concerned with
Okay.
as this issue.
yes, and that's my concern as well.
Okay, yeah, no, but they have not told me this, that they
Okay.
were planning, not in application. I have not seen that in the application.
Okay,
If they did want to use natural gas, they wouldn't need to use the pyrolysis process. So that would eliminate the use of those boilers. That could save them a little bit of money, but that's about, they wouldn't need to remove the impurities from the gas, because the natural gas is pretty pure. So that's the only thing I can think of.
Yeah,
Other than
and
the
the-
Fisher-Tropsch process, they might have to tweak that. And I'm not
yeah,
clear
and
enough.
how they said it is they wouldn't put a tracer in the gas so we wouldn't smell sulfur. So what my concern is what are we going to be smelling in the air if we don't smell anything? So I am concerned with that, and they did publicly say it.
And I did ask him about that as well. I did
Right, I
ask
might
him
feel-
about if I'm sorry, I'll get to.
Good, sure.
The natural gas they're using is not odorized. It has not had the mercaptan added to it. So it is pure natural gas, so there's no sulfur. And mercaptan has a little bit of sulfur, and that's an awful smell that we all smell.
But that's our trigger to say something
Yes.
bad is
Yeah, that's a
happening.
safety.
Right, we won't have that.
No,
Yes.
they won't have that either, yeah.
Okay.
But, you know, they know that, and that's how I believe most industries operate. They don't like those mercaptan contaminants in their
Sure, just
their
goes to
natural
that.
gas. I'm sorry, did you have a question?
Sure. can they go back later and request, and provide another application for the natural gas?
Thank you. And that's, if we move forward with this application and draft a permit, and they want to do something like that, all it takes is a permit modification. And they would have to give us a lot of detail on that. And we would go back out on public notice to.
Right, you'd have to go public.
Yes, we would.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, we would come back and say, okay, it's another, what we're going through now. So that would be required. I haven't actually started drafting the permit yet. So they could, and they still have time to submit something like that to me, they just haven't yet.
Okay.
And I'd be surprised if they didn't do that, because it kind of changes the configuration.
Yes, it does, but that is what they said. Yes.
Okay. I'll continue. I know this chart's. I must have hit the button. But going back to the gasifier, that's the large boiler. Once this synthetic gas is produced, it then it's pretty clean because it comes from wood, and wood doesn't have a lot of contaminants in it. However, it does have a lot of CO2 in it, and that CO2 can foul the Fischer-Tropsch process. So what they do is they have a process called the amine process, and that's a sweetener type process where it takes those impurities out of that synthetic gas before it goes to the Fischer-Tropsch. And that's the next step here in the processing of that gas that's produced from the biomass. I'm going to talk strictly biomass because I haven't talked about natural gas processing natural gas. But, so once the CO2, which is a common greenhouse gas, is removed from that gas product, it is released to the environment. There's no controls on that CO2. It just goes out as CO2 gas from the amine process. At that point, now the gas is clean, and it goes through a very interesting process called Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. This process has been around for a very long time, and it's very interesting. If you ever want to Google it, look it up. That's what I had to do. And what that does is it forms the hydrocarbons, the formation for these fuels that they want to produce. And once it goes through that Fischer-Tropsch synthesis process, it is then further processed through hydroprocessing and distillation. That is the process that breaks the hydrocarbons and creates the fuels that they want to produce at the facility. At that point, after that point, they either have generated jet fuel, diesel, or naphtha, and it goes out to the tank farm. Now, backing up a little bit, as this synthetic gas product that they use in that is generated, if any one of these processes has an upset of its own or goes offline for any reason, and they've been generating that syngas, they need to have it go somewhere. So in that case, they have proposed installing a very large flare. This flare is a stack of and it has a flame on it, and it's flamed by natural gas. So in the event that there's something goes on downstream that they cannot process the synthetic gas that they just produced, they send it to the flare for complete destruction before it's released into the environment or the atmosphere. And this is emission point 3 right there. The company doesn't want to send stuff to the flare because they just spend a lot of money making this synthetic gas. But it is a safety precaution because this synthetic gas needs to go somewhere if something downstream malfunctions or if there's an upset. Okay, so, and that's a point of this emissions. Okay, so there are 4 other points of emission here. They have a thermal oil heater and a cooling tower. The thermal oil heater uses natural gas to heat oil, which is sent into the process to maintain certain temperatures throughout that process. So if things start to cool down, mainly in the winter, they heat that oil up and they send it through the process and it keeps everything at a specific minimum temperature. And just the opposite for the cooling tower. In the hot summer months, if things get a little hot, they send water through to pull that thermal content off that process and cool it down through a cooling water or cooling tower. They also will have an emergency engine for generating power and an emergency fire pump. These are only in cases of emergency, but they do have to run them a few minutes every week to make sure that they're operational in the event that they're needed. So these are pretty minor emission points, but they will operate them on a regular basis to make sure that everything's properly functioning, or functioning properly, I'm sorry. Okay, so now that all the fuels have been generated and they are sent to the tank farm, the fuels are sent to a day tank, which then the fuel can be sent to a final fuel that goes, is directed to the product loadout, which is either a truck or rail car, or it goes to off-spec fuel, which is returned for further processing until it meets the specification for the fuel that they're generating. And here they have the jet fuel, the diesel, and the naphtha. At the loadout, the fuels take it to loadout, and the loadout has a vapor control system. And that means anytime the fuel's loaded into a truck or a train, the vapors that are generated are captured and they are sent to a flare. And that flare is right here. And it is also a natural gas flame that will burn any vapors that come off that loadout area. There are some potential for fugitive emissions here, but it's mostly volatile organic carbon compounds. Volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, from slight equipment leaks or here and there, but they'll be doing regular inspection, maintenance, and record keeping to ensure that that's kept at a minimum. Okay, that's what I know of their process, at least what they've shared with me, and how they're going to propose to operate. Those were all the points listed for the emissions, and those are on those tables, and I can get more copies of that if anyone's interested. Yes.
I've heard that Red Rock has several other facilities already in production in the U.S. Is that correct?
I think they do, but I don't think they're using this process. I think they're ethanol.
Right.
I don't think that they're using this pyrolysis and Fischer-Tropsch process. Yeah. Okay. So that's how I understand how they're going to operate with their emissions. So back in December 3rd, DEQ, December 3rd, 2014, DEQ received their application. And at that time, it went to our permit coordinator for administrative review. What administrative review entails is making sure that the applicant is a registered company in Oregon. They submit the proper fees so that we can move forward with issuing drafting the permit. And they also requires that they submit a signed land use compatibility statement from the local planning department. And we did get that land use compatibility statement on February 12th, 2013. That's like a month ago from today. At that point, our permit coordinator said this application is administratively complete, and she hands it to me. And now my job is to review the application for technical completeness and talk with them. Yes?
So the land use planning here in our town already has signed off on that?
Yes. I received it on February 12th.
So how can they do that if the urban growth boundary, because they're out of the urban growth boundary where they bought the land, how does that work when it hasn't even been approved and you've extended the urban growth boundary without, I mean, this is part of the land use.
Yeah.
I don't understand how they could do that. Does anyone have an answer?
Well, I'll speak to that. I'm the
Okay.
county planning director. The use was approved, went through a review process, and was approved in the exclusive farm use zone, which it lies in now.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why, I mean, it has been approved, went through a process, and then the process you're talking about for the urban growth boundary and expansion and future annexation, all that is yet to happen.
So LCDC,
that stuff could happen
it's
Why
later.
didn't that happen beforehand?
Right. This doesn't
Why
make
didn't it
sense,
happen
it's
before?
going backwards.
That's correct.
Because it can be allowed, and it is approved to be allowed as a standalone process, not being annexed onto the public service.
Without a conditional use permit or anything?
Yeah, it went through that process. Yeah, ORS
So you did it.
283 sub 1 use.
I don't understand how you could do that after the fact. It just seems odd to me.
And we can more, this
Yeah.
is a, DEQ, we can talk more about that.
Yes.
Yeah, because-
Let me
because
go
I-
ahead and finish
yeah.
mine, because what we plan on doing is, we're all gonna be here, and, we can talk to the different, government agencies and their roles, and address those kinds of
Right.
questions. Because I'm not a good person to address.
No,
that
it's
question.
been backwards. Everything has been backwards with this.
But I can tell you that I can't even start looking at the application until I have that. So, and I just got it a month ago, and when the application was given to me, and the first thing I do is what I shared with you at the very beginning. I kind of go through every process that they're proposing to do, and look at those emission points. And then I start taking a really close look at all their control devices, whether that be the selective catalytic reduction unit or the bag house, to make sure that they are properly sized and will do the job that they're required to do.
I have one question
Sure.
on going out in the trucks. The
Going out
NAPTA.
where?
Yeah, the NAPTA is the only one before it gets loaded out, they have to flare it.
Well,
So,
that's the one I think that has the highest potential for vapors.
right,
So
so
that's the one that will
how,
get flared.
so how are they gonna do it when they're loading it? How's the flare in that system working? I guess I don't understand that one.
So it'll be done, and there'll be a vapor, collection system. So when the gases are collected, they'll come up and they'll be directed to probably a hose of some type.
But there's emissions coming
Yeah.
off of that.
No, there's no emissions. They'll be captured. That's the point. That they capture any of those vapors that come off that loading, and they convey them to that flare.
Okay.
It's not a fugitive emission. It is a collected emission which is controlled and sent to the flare. And I didn't bring any details to show that, the mechanics of that. But
Right, because yeah, before
Okay,
it loads
well,
out there. So I
it's
kind of
good to
looked
know.
on the
I
website.
can try to get that
Okay.
and stuff for you.
Okay.
I just wasn't prepared to go into that great a detail at this stage. I was just trying to generally cover what they're showing me. So in my review, I go through all their emission control devices, and then I get into how they calculate their emissions. Because I asked them to provide me what their potential to emit is. And what a facility will do is they'll use references, known references, that they base their production on, and they can calculate how much emissions they expect at every point source along that process diagram. And what they do to calculate their potential to emit, they make a couple assumptions. The main assumption that they use is they're going to operate every day of the year at maximum capacity. And they say, well, when we operate, it's seldomly done, but they can. If they operate every day of the year at maximum capacity, what are their emissions going to be? And then they show those calculations, and they make reference to how those calculations were determined, and I review them. I sit back and I look and I cross-reference and verify the references they made and the calculations and how they were calculated. And sometimes I have questions, and I constantly do, because some of these calculations can be very complicated. And I call them up and say, clarify for me, and they do. So even though I got the original application back in December of 2014, I'm still getting updated information as late as last Friday. And they've been responding to me, because when I want to know something, I want it in writing so that if I can understand it, the public and everyone else can understand it as well. And that's important to all of us, yeah.
Are any of these figures based on proprietary information?
No.
And are any of their assumptions on similar areas based on, proprietary information?
No, they're not.
So it's all based on actual
Science.
emissions from existing facilities
Right,
throughout the process?
yes.
Good, thank you.
And then they make this very conservative assumption that they're operating 24/7 for only 8,760 hours a year at full capacity, which is a lot. I mean, realistically, they're not going to be able to do that, but that's what they did when they submitted their potential to emit. So I verified these calculations, and I then created a chart, and that's what I have here. This is a very important table to me as a permit writer. I generated it for you to see, but I also generated it for me, because it tells me a lot about how I need to proceed with this application. But first, there's 4 columns here. I'm going to spend a little bit of time going through this so that you can know what, I try to tell you everything I know and explain it, but feel free to stop me because there's a lot to this. The first column are the regulated pollutants. Those pollutants include particulate matter of 10 microns or less, particulate matter of 2.5 microns or less, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and VOCs. These regulated pollutants I just mentioned are referred to as criteria pollutants. And how criteria pollutants were originally developed is the Clean Air Act required EPA to develop limitations, national ambient air quality standards based on public health and environmental risk. And what EPA did is they did just that. They created these standards, and they referred to these standards as criteria pollutants. They created them for what they called criteria pollutants, and that's how these criteria pollutants are generated. So those are criteria pollutants. I didn't mention greenhouse gas. It is a regulated pollutant, but it is not a criteria pollutant. Criteria pollutants are something different. They're based on public health and environmental potential impacts. So that is that first column. The second column is the information they provided me on their application. This is the column that shows their potential to emit for each one of those criteria pollutants and greenhouse gas. Again, like I said, they assumed that they'd operate 365 days a year, 24/7 to come up with these emissions. The third column is the significant emission rate column. This is the column that's very important to me as a permit writer. And how significant emission rates were developed was EPA developed them, DEQ agreed upon them, and we put them in our rule. But the way EPA states them is that if a facility emits at or above these levels, they are considered an emitter of significant level of that pollutant. If the facility emits below the level of established significant emission rate, then they're considered an emitter of less than significant values. And as you can see, if they operated 365 days a year, all of their potentials to emit are below these, what are called significant emission rates, with the exception of greenhouse gas, of course. It is a regulated pollutant, and they do emit greenhouse gases at or above levels that are considered significant. But we do have a rule, Oregon Administrative Rule, Chapter 240, Division 224, that states that you cannot consider a source, a major source of pollutants based on their greenhouse gas emissions alone. So, based on that rule, they are not considered a major source of polluter based on greenhouse gas emissions. Okay.
Excuse me.
Yes.
But if that PM10 that's at 14.38, we're at 15, greenhouse gas emissions could be considered as part of a regulated pollutant.
Yes.
And so that's cutting it mighty close, as is CO.
Yes.
And that's normally planned by industry. And so I very much hope that you test that.
Yes, that is something that we will do in the permit. When they're up and operating, the first thing we'll say is within a few months after you're fully operational, we want you to source test and verify that these are, in fact, your potential.
And if they do not, and if they are at 15 or above, what happens to their permitting then, particularly regarding greenhouse gas emissions? And I guess that's a rhetorical question in that, you know, essentially it's a facility that's already built. And so there's not a heck of a lot you're going to do about it.
No, there's things we can do. We can do. Now, what we would do, if they haven't actually exceeded their limit, but they show that they have the potential to exceed their limit, we would tell them that they have to curtail their production accordingly.
But you need to have monitors to be able to do that. And so
Right,
Title
and
V
that's called
permitting.
source testing, and we do source testing, and that's how we verify it. So they will be required to source test.
And that would be, source testing means under best case scenario, when, with an advance notice that you're coming, versus continuous monitoring that would allow us to see what's being output anytime we choose as citizens. And so I'm very much hoping that there's continuous monitoring on these emissions so that we can see such things.
There will be for NOx, or nitrogen oxide, because they're required to by rule for those large boilers. The way that we're going to find out that they are at 15 is through source testing. And those are under best conditions, as you mentioned. So if they come back and they say, well, we're at 15, and that was based on source testing, we're going to hold them to that. And the first thing we'll do is say, you got to curtail your production to meet the limit that we provided you. That means you cannot produce as much as you were hoping to.
Right, but will you also go back and say, you know, your greenhouse gas emissions now also are regulated because you've come over the top of one of the other regulated pollutants?
Only if they exceeded the 15 tons. They can,
right.
Let me.
I'm following, but.
Yeah. Let me talk about the plant-side emission limits, because this is really an important part of what you're talking about, and maybe I can get back to it after I talk about that. So if a source has the potential to emit less than a significant emission rate, we have a rule in Oregon Administrative Rule Chapter 340, Division 226, that states they will be issued a generic plant-side emission limit. And what the rule also states is a generic plant-site emission limit is the significant emission rate minus 1 ton per year. And these emission limits are all 1 ton less than the significant emission rate, even though their potential is much less. So these are annual limits of tons per year. And these tons per year are a rolling plant-site emission limit. That means that it's not a calendar year, but every month they have to meet, they have to report an emission that they have for that month, let's just say March, and they have to add that to the previous 11 months of emissions to get a 12-month rolling, to show what they've done in the last 12 months. So, to get back to your question, if we have them test within the first 3 months of operation, they've only been in operation 3 months, so they really haven't hit the 15 tons yet, because they've only been there for 3 months. So what we would do is say, you've got to curtail your operation to meet that 14 tons. You have to, and that means if you're producing less fuel, that's what you have to do. And if you don't do that, then there's penalties, fines.
So you will put a 14-ton limit on their permit?
For that.
That will be the top end for them?
For them, yeah, it will be a 14-ton limit, and that's by rule. Yes.
You say that they have to report.
Yes.
How often do you come and inspect them? And are any of the inspections spot tests? Spot inspections?
There are unannounced inspections that it really depends on when we're down here. We seem to be down here a lot, and so we can come in unannounced and just do an inspection.
But other than that, is it all volunteer on their part? To make sure they check that, or how?
No, we will hold them accountable for maintenance and record keeping and documenting that they've looked at it, and then we will go there and check those records, and then we'll verify what they say that they're showing us in the report, and hold them accountable to that. So the important thing that I really wanted to take away from this is that even though these are generic level limitations, they apply to a rolling 12-month limit. So it can happen, they'll be held to that 14 tons at January plus the previous 11 months, February previous 11 months. So they're constantly being held to that limit. And they will not be able to exceed it and then average it out. That's not a possibility here. And that's how our rules are set up to regulate these types, and our permits are written to regulate these types of facilities. Okay. Yes?
Just trying to get some perspective here. At this maximum level, 365 days a year, what tonnage of biomass is going to go into the front end of this thing in that year? What volume of biomass are we talking about to create this? Is that in the permit?
It's in their application, and it's in there in a couple of different ways. When we talk about biomass, you can talk about it in dry tons. They talk about it in bone dry tons. They talk about it with water content, and obviously there's some changes there. But I've heard 140,000 bone dry tons. But that could equate to quite a few more tons if you add water to it. So it's about, you know, if you say 140,000 bone dry tons a year, that's kind of puts everybody on the same understanding of the amount of mass that will be moving through them. Yeah.
This is a kind of a wacko question.
I don't think so.
Well, you haven't heard it yet. And that is, has the company, has Red Rock made a provision for like locals to turn up with their biomass to give it to them? Because, I mean, I just spent 5 days burning 2 big, huge piles of wood in my backyard that, quite honestly, I would have loved to have taken down there.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay.
I know that they addressed that last week in their meeting, but I don't recall. I know some people were talking about switchgrass and other biomass. I'm not sure. I guess it would have to be a question for them. I think that they are probably a little careful about what they want to process, because it has to, that wood or whatever it is has to have a certain heat content that they want to extract from it, or a BTU value product.
Well, if I may ask, in the PM, the 3 PM categories, what are the primary sources of those emissions?
The PM?
Yeah.
Well, some of the significant emissions, or fugitive emissions, yeah, dust. They included those. They said this is how much we project, and you know we'll control them. And then the natural gas. It does generate some. They're going to be combusting quite a bit of natural gas, and some of that does come off as PM. They have, what else do they have? They have the engines for the exhaust from the engines for the emergency generator and the emergency fire pump, and the cooling tower. And when that water comes back to be cooled, it will allow very little, but some particular matter to be evaporated into the air. Yes?
Would any of those particulate, the pollutants, change if they went to gas? Which one would change? I mean, if they were not going to use trees and wood mass, what would that change on that? I mean, you don't, you weren't prepared for this.
Yeah,
but
I think it could change a lot. I think it would actually probably reduce a lot of the emissions significantly. I think if they went natural gas, it would eliminate a lot of their emissions because they would no longer need the boilers. That's a big part of what they meant, is through those large boilers.
Well, it would be a good way for them to mitigate some of these figures if they included this disruption in their annual emissions figures that are going to be operating on natural gas.
That's right.
So I would assume that it would be to their benefit to include it into this process.
Yeah.
My question about particulate matter, I have 2 of them. One is, are we still not a maintenance area for PM10? And are there any requirements because of that? And then secondly, the PM advance plan that was signed off by the state and the town to EPA saw a 7% increase in industrial emissions from now until 2019. Where does this fit into that? How much of that 7% has been used by this project? And in other words, is it over? And how does this fit into that that long-term plan that was recently signed. I'd like that taken into consideration if possible.
Yeah. This is
Because there's a
still-
permitting reason that, I mean, part of the reason that plan was done, it was to allow permitting like this to take place under the conditions that you're writing this permit under. And so I'm very much interested in that question as to how this fits into that PM advanced plan, how the emissions, again, the plan says a 7% increase in industrial point source emissions from what we currently have till 2019. Where does this fit into that? You know what I'm talking about. So I'd like that figure. I would like that worked out.
This is a PM10.
It is a PM10 maintenance area, that's the one question you asked. And how these guys fit in terms of permitting is because they're below that 15 tons per year, they don't trigger that threshold of being considered a significant emission, PM10 emissions at significant levels. So they're not going to be subject to specific federal requirements for those maintenance areas. They have lower levels than those thresholds that are identified here. And I guess I may not have described that well, but the significant emission limits were significant emission rates. What they've done is they've calculated it and they said, these rates will work for sources. If you emit lower than this, you'll be less than significant at your property boundary line. So that's how the significant emission rate was developed through EPA and adopted with DEQ. I imagine that also allows for some allowances. That threshold allows for industrial allowances to come in and economic development in areas where there are impacts. And I'm not sure if you want to talk about that PM. Yeah,
So the PM10 plan would be the inventory of current emissions. That included all permits that we had on file for sources or potential sources. Since that time, Lakeview Coaching withdrawn their application. They're no longer a potential there, and that's used to never going to be here and they're not. So I'll have to look and exactly see the difference between that source and this source. But I would guess, because that source is now gone, this one is coming.
Well, it's not gone.
It's going to be a wash.
It's not gone. Their permit hasn't been withdrawn yet.
It's gone.
Well, so you were saying DEQ, you are now saying that Iberdrola has pulled their permit for their project.
Their permit's
Okay,
gone.
all right. That's the first I've heard of that publicly.
I think it just happened like last
It
week.
happened the first, second of March.
No, it expires in November.
Yeah, I was surprised too. They said, no, we don't want to pursue this.
All right, well, that's news.
Sorry, I didn't realize.
Well, regardless,
Yeah.
the emissions inventory that you guys did showed a 7% increase regardless of the source. And so I'm very much interested in what this project does to that 7% increase that was planned as part of that inventory, and how that might affect the plan.
Yeah, we'll look at that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's a good question. Okay. And this goes back to what we've just been talking about for the last 15 minutes. Because their emissions of their PM10 microns are less than 15 tons per year, they are not going to be subject to federal requirements of being considered a major source of emissions based on PM10. And this can be found in OAR Chapter 340, Division 224, Rule number 001, Section 1. And that states that if a source emits below the significant emission rate, it is not subject to these standards. It's specifically for areas of maintenance. So they are below that. But the same rule also has another section that says if you're not subject to that best available control technology, you are subject to highest and best practical treatment and control. And this rule directs the permit writer, me, to OAR Chapter 340, Division 226. And it requires things as pollution control, operation and maintenance requirements, typically available control technologies which the industry uses, and standards of performance for new stationary sources. standards of performance for new stationary sources is the key one here, because EPA promulgates rules for standards of performance for new stationary sources based on processes and equipment. And DEQ then in turn adopts those rules by reference in OER Chapter 340, Division 238. And to give an example, those large boilers, there is a standard of performance for new stationary sources for those boilers, and that requires them to control the amount of nitrogen oxides that those boilers emit. It also requires them to look at particulate matter and sulfur dioxide, but then the rule goes on to say if you're only emitting or combusting natural gas, then nitrogen oxide is the one you need to control. And that's why in their application they proposed a selective catalytic reduction unit to treat the emissions from both those boilers. And it was in a rule from that reference right there that required that. And I'll be using that. And there are a number of other performance standards that are required as well. Everything from the tanks to leaks of volatile organic compounds from valves and equipment to do regular inspections and maintenance and record keeping to ensure that those are minimized at the facility. And this is something that I'll be spending a lot of my time on in the next few weeks when I draft this permit, is this rule permit. So when I do get back, the first thing I do is I'm going to start drafting this permit, and I'll take a lot of what we talked about tonight into consideration. I may ask for them to clarify, like natural gas processing. Once I draft that permit, it goes through internal review, and then I'll put it out on public 35-day public notice. I will schedule a hearing, a public hearing here in Lakeview at the Senior Center 30 days into that public notice. And anyone that's signed in here, I'll be sure to get you on the mailing list to inform you of not only the permit going on public notice, but of that hearing. My goal right now is to get the permit drafted and have that hearing sometime in early May. That means I have to get the permit drafted and on public notice sometime in April. Once I get all the comments, I'll review them, respond to them, and at the end of the public notice, we'll take action on the final permit. Yes?
So if given Red Rock has already suggested they were going to use natural gas if processes were disrupted, and they have not provided this information to you, does that delay your process?
It could, especially when I call them up and say, well, what are you doing? And they say, well, we're considering this. And I say, well, I cannot move forward with my process until you provide me with additional information. At that point, what we do is we suspend the application until I'm provided that information. And I have a lot of permits to work on.
Is there a threshold? Is there a threshold where they have to use a certain amount of a different fuel type that isn't permitted in order to trigger permitting restrictions or requirements? So if they only use it 5% at the time, does it even need to be considered as part of the?
It does.
Okay.
It does. We need to be adequately describing the process in the permit so that it's being truly represented in those emissions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is it the EA that will take in the noise, the 40-some trucks going through town on the outside with the emissions of diesel trucks, bringing the biomass in, and who's in charge of the other stuff outside that plant? Is that their EA to the federal government, or I guess because the noise, I didn't see anything in their permit of the noise that they would be doing.
That would normally be like a county kind of planning issue to begin with, which we didn't have a part of.
Right, the noise, they haven't given us.
The EA would be next.
If
they included it in there.
And I thought DEQ was part of that, so if it isn't, who is the?
Yeah, we don't get involved with the.
So do you know who it is on
What?
is it the county?
right there, Darwin.
I am not, I don't know.
Darwin, is it the county?
I'll have to get back to you on that, but from how I understood it before, the DEQ does have noise standards,
Right.
and as
right.
long as they're within the noise standards, and
But-
I'm not sure if there's.
That's not part of their permit, though. They didn't put in any
No,
noise
it's part of
standards.
the conditions that they have to be, under and there's, for each different type of use, there's certain standards.
Right,
They have
but
to
it's
follow.
not part of that permit, because I looked
Not part of
online and I didn't see anything on noise on the permit they submitted to you.
Normally
I'm pretty
noise
much
is something
limited
that's.
to what happens on
Right.
site. And if it's an industrial park, there's gonna be noise.
Right, and they haven't,
And I
I
don't
didn't.
really have the authority to go and say, you guys do have to be quiet.
No, but they have to let the town, and part of my concern is when they went out to get the property, they notified people within 250 feet of the project. Other projects in the county, they went out 1,500 feet. I think this includes the whole valley of Goose Lake when you're talking this kind of industry, and it just is such not a good way that our county and town has done this. And so I am concerned with the trucks, the out in the forest. I haven't even seen a forest plan of what DEQ on forest land is going to do. So there's a lot of stuff that hasn't come together that should be. And as I understand from the last meeting, their EA is already into, is it the DOC or somewhere? and we haven't seen it yet. So I have no idea what's all these other parameters of doing an industry like this that we are not even aware of. And I just feel this hasn't really been open for public to, if 250 feet, I didn't know about where they were going to put this. I didn't know about it till it was already done. So I want it to be pretty open from here on out, because we are talking about a huge impact to this wonderful, wonderful valley. And I tell you, who is going to want this? I don't. I do not want this here in this valley.
Don't you think, though, that those trucks will only replace the trucks that we used to have when we had 4 lumber mills up and running?
Not necessarily. If you look back on the timber.
And if we're having a vote, I'm for one in very much in favor of
So
this.
Sarah, to your question, DEQ does not take into account any emissions that happen to occur in the gathering of the wood and the fuels
Right,
themselves.
and that's, I'm concerned about it.
That may
Yes.
be something that's included as part of an EA, as part of the NEPA process, but it's not likely, and dependent upon what DOD decides to include in the NEPA process. But noise is something that's also at a county zoning level.
Right. I live here. I've lived here for a long time. I like this place. I love this place. And this isn't really 25 jobs. I think we can get real creative on trying to find something else besides this. So, yeah, that's where I'm at.
Well, sure. So that said, it's no secret that the EPA soon, hopefully, will be reaching a decision on PM 2.5 designation for Lakeview. And if Gina McCarthy does rule in what I think is in our favor, that will have significant, I'd imagine, impacts on the permit as you write it. And so that still is something that's up in the air. Has Red Rock come to you with any proposals for mitigating any of their pollution? So Iberdrola had a variety of mitigation strategies, primarily money thrown at the wood stove replacement program to offset some of their pollution issues. And so is Red Rock offering any of that? Have they offered any of that up to this point? And if not, is that something that you will even consider, given Lakeview's participation in the PM Advance program, or those are strategies that were supposed to be pursued as part of that program?
I talked only pretty much with their consultant. I haven't. So their consultant does represent them, but
right. So can I add to this in that I understand that DEQ has put off the rules that they wanted to that you guys wanted to go forward with, called the kitchen sink rules, and from January in front of the Environmental Quality Commission until April. So a lot of this is running in this next month concurrent with decisions that are being made both at EPA and with the Environmental Quality Commission concerning this question of sustainment here in Lakeview. And then that is supposed to apply to offsets to businesses like this to help better our pollution issues here. And so, unfortunately, the sustainment designation has no triggers. And so I guess the point is that I'm saying here is, what's your trigger? And what's Red Rock's trigger in providing, you know, some relief as part of that program? So thanks.
Emission offsets. That's all the word.
Well, they're not required to provide offsets, but the point that I'm trying to make is that they should have backed on their emissions because of Lakeview's problems with air quality. And so part of the sustainment designation was to allow for DEQ to provide these non-required kind of offsets of businesses like Red Rock in exactly this circumstance. And so I'm just hoping that that's part of this process and part of your permit writing.
Yeah, we're assuming that the sustainment areas will go through, it's not a practice permit. So we're practice permit as if we are going through.
The sustainment designation and EPA ruling against us. That is that.
Ruling against us.
There is a petition to redesignate Lakeview as non-attainment under the Clean Air Act for PM 2.5.
I'm going to assume that we're going to have them before this permit decision.
We've been told that EPA is in the process of responding, so I imagine you have to.
They haven't told us that. So.
Okay.
As I mentioned earlier, I have talked with a consultant, and I have to be, I know that I asked, I think you met her last week, Cheryl Davis. I talked to her a lot, I even met with her, and she's told me that Red Rock does have interest in helping the community. But that's coming from the consultant, and it's not coming from them, so you know, you can take that for whatever it's worth. But they have expressed some interest in providing help to the community. They just haven't, they've done that through their consultant to me, and it hasn't really come from the company itself, so that's what I've heard.
These public information meetings are not only good for you and us, but it's good for Red Rock too, and they're helping in that exchange and help go forward. So it's good that you're having it, and Red Rock for doing it.
So, I know we're going to stick around and talk more one-on-one if anyone's interested. But my contact information is here. I also do have my business cards that you could take. Feel free to contact me. The more I talk with people, the more I learn too. Thank you.